Memphis, October 1992. A dice game just broke up at a Southbrook apartment complex, and 6 young men wander outside into the night. What happens next deserves to be told. Not because it's famous, but because of how ordinary the events you'll see in this video started and how dark it ended. This is that story, told through the courtroom testimony, the confessions, and the words of neighbors who heard a man calling for God's help while he bled to death. The sentencing phase of a capital murder trial always has a different rhythm than the guilt phase, because by then, the defendant has already been convicted by the jury, especially if he or she committed murder. What they're weighing now is to determine if that murder deserves death or life in prison. And in this part of Tennessee, the jury had a reputation for choosing death more often than almost anywhere else in the state. When the prosecution called Vivian Lewis to the stand in Andre Bland's sentencing hearing, the courtroom went quiet in a way that courtrooms rarely do. Lewis was a deaf-mute woman, which meant she needed an interpreter standing beside her to translate what her hands were about to say. The prosecutor needed her to explain what had been taken from the Sanders family on October 9, 1992. And even though Lewis couldn't speak or hear, what came next hit harder than any dramatic testimony. When she began signing, the interpreter said her son, Terry Sanders, had been a sweet kid. He'd been good, had never been in trouble with anyone, and never caused problems. He had 2 daughters who were 2 and 4 years old at the time of this trial. They were very worried because they wanted to see their father. The jury understood those words to mean that 2 little girls would be growing up without a father because of the man sitting at the defense table. The man at the defense table was Andre Bland. He was 21 years old at the time, watching this woman describe the son he'd killed. The jury was watching him too, having already convicted him of first-degree premeditated murder, aggravated robbery, attempted first-degree murder, and attempted aggravated robbery. They waited to decide his fate. The prosecution brought in Dr. Sandra Elkins next, and her testimony gave the jury the medical framework for understanding exactly how Terry Sanders had died. She was the forensic pathologist who'd performed the autopsy, and the details she presented were both clinical and devastating. According to Dr. Elkins, Sanders had had 9 gunshot wounds to his right leg from his groin down to just above his knee. Based on the pattern of entrance and exit wounds, she determined he was shot 4 or 5 times, and the bullets had passed through his leg multiple times, creating more wounds than actual shots fired. And one of those bullets had torn through the major blood vessel in his thigh, and because of that, he had bled to death. The detail that made this case different from a typical shooting was that the nerve in his thigh had only been bruised, but still intact enough to keep functioning. According to her, this only meant that the man would have been conscious for 4 to 5 minutes after being shot. So he might have lived up to 15 minutes total depending on how fast he bled out. And because that nerve still worked, he would have felt everything the entire time. The prosecution wasn't relying solely on medical testimony. They had witnesses who'd been there that night, neighbors who'd heard and seen what happened to Terry Sanders in real time. Floyd Johnson owned the green pickup truck at the parking lot near his upstairs apartment at Southbrook. On the night of October 9th, he had heard gunshots and looked out his window. What he'd seen was a man lying partially under his truck, upper body exposed and covered in blood. The man had been calling out for God to help him over and over. Johnson testified that he'd been terrified to go down there because he thought that whoever had done this might come back, or worse, still be around. But he couldn't just ignore someone dying below his apartment either. So he had stayed on his balcony and done the only thing he could think of, and that was to talk to the man. He continued talking to the man for about 10 minutes, telling him to stay still, that help was coming. While another neighbor, Henry Adams, had seen the actual shooting happen. Adams lived in an upstairs apartment too, and when he'd heard the gunshots, he had looked out his back door and seen a man with a large shiny gun kneeling down beside the truck as if shooting underneath it. Adams had watched the man fire 3 shots in quick succession. Then the man stood up and ran off into the darkness. That's when Adams had heard the screaming start, and he immediately called 911. The ambulance had arrived 9 minutes after the call. But it hadn't mattered because by the time the paramedics had reached the man, his condition had already been critical. They'd loaded him into the ambulance and rushed toward the hospital, but the man had died before they'd gotten there, bleeding out from that torn vessel, conscious and in pain for at least 5 of those final minutes. Under Tennessee law, the murder had been especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel in that it involved torture or serious physical abuse beyond that necessary to produce death. But what the jury didn't fully understand yet was why Terry Sanders had even been in that parking lot in the first place, because he wasn't one of the original targets that night. He also wasn't the person Andre Bland and his friends had set out to rob, because they had spotted strangers who seemed like easy targets. The young man had just driven into the complex at exactly the wrong moment, and when he'd seen what was happening to someone else, he'd made the choice to try and help, and that decision had cost him his life. The story of what happened that night started earlier in the evening with a dice game at Carlos Sanders' apartment, and it helps to understand the environment that produced it. Memphis in 1992 was deep into what would become one of the city's most violent periods. The crack epidemic that had exploded across American cities in the mid-'80s was still tearing through neighborhoods. Gang activity was spiking, and violence was becoming normalized. By the end of the year, Memphis would record over 200 homicides. In that kind of environment, young men carrying guns wasn't unusual. Even young folks gambling in apartment complexes and looking for easy money wasn't unusual either. Andre Bland was 19 years old that October, and he'd grown up in circumstances the defense would later describe as difficult. No father in the picture, raised by his mother and grandmother doing their best, but difficult circumstances were common in Memphis in 1992, and Bland stood out due to his history in the neighborhood. He had a juvenile record of multiple assaults and batteries, car thefts, drug convictions, all since age 11. He had dropped out of high school in 11th grade after getting suspended for disrespecting a teacher. By the time he was 19, he was selling drugs on the street and carrying a chrome 9mm pistol as part of that business. That pistol would become the central character in what happened that night, changing hands multiple times before it was used to kill Sanders. The dice game at Carlos Sanders' apartment had included him, Darrell Bailey, Martell Pollard, Carlos himself, a man named Pat, and 2 others known only as Steve and Yogi. The game had broken up around 10 p.m. and the group had wandered outside into the parking lot. At some point between 10:30 and 11:30, they'd spotted 2 strangers, Ernest Norman and Marcel Nugent, who had come to the complex earlier to visit a friend. The group had noticed them, decided they looked like they might have money, and made what seemed like an almost casual decision to rob them. The full story of what actually happened during that robbery didn't come out until 2 days later, when Andre Bland walked into the Memphis Police Department and told detectives everything in his own words. October 12, 1992, was when the investigation into Terry Sanders' murder really broke open. Andre was convinced to turn himself in by his mother and grandmother because the police were already looking for him and witnesses had seen what happened. It was only a matter of time before he got picked up. So Andre sat down with detectives and gave his statement that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. According to his statement, it was when Yogi approached him saying he was going to rob 2 strangers they'd spotted that he handed the gun to him. Ernest Norman and Marcel Nugent had been at Southbrook to visit a friend. When they'd noticed the group hanging around, they didn't think much of it. About 30 minutes later, when they headed back to their car to leave, the group made their move with aggressive questions designed to intimidate who they were, where they were from, and to give them all the money they had on them. Both men tried to ignore them. So they hit Norman in the back of the head as he was getting into his car. He ran for his life. As he fled, he heard someone yelling to shoot him, followed by a gun going off. But he kept running until he reached a gas station and called 911. He had escaped. His friend Marcel Nugent wasn't so lucky. Nugent had locked himself inside the car, but now he was trapped because the group surrounded the vehicle, hitting the windows with rocks and fists, trying to pry the doors open. That was the situation Terry Sanders drove into when he arrived at the complex that night. Sanders had gotten out of his car and approached the group attacking the car, and according to Nugent's testimony, the men had said something to Sanders, but he didn't engage them and just turned around instead to walk back to his car. He had sized up the situation, decided it wasn't worth getting involved, and was leaving. But Andre gave a different story. He said that Sanders had approached them with a different intent, and that was when he shot him in the leg. Sanders started running despite the bullet in his leg, the blood, and pain. Adrenaline kicked in and he covered 273 feet through that apartment complex, nearly a football field's length, stumbling and limping, driven by desperate hope he could escape. Behind him, Andre and associate Daryl Bailey jogged to follow like they were out for an evening jog, and almost like they knew he couldn't possibly get away. When Sanders went around the building, Andre went around and shot him in the leg again. That was the shot that dropped Sanders. He tried to crawl under Floyd Johnson's green pickup truck, thinking the darkness might hide him, but Andre found him again and shot him again when he tried to crawl under. Sanders continued pulling himself underneath and started screaming. That was when Floyd Johnson and Henry Adams saw him underneath the truck, but Andre left the man bleeding because there was still business with Nugent. So when he and Bailey jogged back, the others had smashed through the passenger window and dragged the trapped man out through the broken glass. Although he fought hard, broke free and started running. His jacket was ripped off. Someone yelled that the man had a gun, but whether he actually did is unclear, and Andre shot him in the leg. They took his watch and money while kicking and beating him. Andre shot him again on the other leg to prevent him from moving. After that, they scattered, leaving Nugent bleeding and crawling up the stairs to his friend's apartment and waited for the ambulance, having been robbed, beaten, and shot twice. Under the truck, Sanders was still alive and conscious, and in very terrible pain. Screaming for God to help him, his voice got weaker over 10 or 15 minutes until the ambulance finally came. Andre said that he just turned around and ran to his girlfriend Teresa Wiggs's house where they had gone to sleep. And while Andre was sleeping, Terry Sanders died in the ambulance. Near the pickup truck, they discovered an unemployment check, a bloody dollar bill, loose change, keys, and a black cap. But Sanders' wallet was missing. When detectives asked Andre about taking anything, he denied robbing anyone but admitted he'd known the others had gone through the man's pockets. However, Nugent's testimony contradicted this. He testified that the entire group, including Andre, had participated. Andre had told detectives he hadn't been shooting to kill. That's why he had shot them in their legs instead of their chests or heads. But when he'd shot Sanders, it was because he had approached them and said something offensive. The 273 feet Sanders ran was almost 100 yards of parking lot and apartment walkways that he covered while injured, terrified, and dying. And the fact that Andre and Bailey jogged behind him the entire time meant that there was no urgency, because they knew Sanders wasn't escaping. They had the gun. They had the time. They had all the power, but there was one more detail worth noting, which was his excuse for why Sanders ended up with so many wounds. He said that the gun had been automatic, and it had kept repeating shots, which was not also true. But when Andre's case went to trial, his story would shift in revealing ways that exposed the contradictions at the heart of his defense. When the defense got their turn during the sentencing phase, they called Marilyn Boyd, Andre's mother, Virginia Bland, his grandmother, and Andre himself. The picture they tried to paint was familiar in death penalty cases. Difficult childhood, absent father, single mother and grandmother doing their best. These were the two women who convinced Andre to turn himself in, stood by him, loved him, and were begging the jury to spare his life. But the prosecution made sure the jury heard the other side. Dropping out of high school in 11th grade after being suspended for disrespecting a teacher, he had a juvenile record starting at the age 11 with multiple assaults and batteries, several car thefts, and at least one drug conviction, a pattern of escalating violence. Then Andre took the stand, and his testimony showed there were contradictions that undermined his defense. At trial, he testified he shot Terry Sanders because he had ran back to his car as if going for his gun. But this contradicted both his confession and witness testimony. Nugent, trapped inside the car watching everything, testified that the man had simply turned around and walked back to his car with no threatening behavior. Just a man leaving a dangerous situation. The jury had heard everything and had to weigh the aggravating circumstances against the mitigating circumstances. The state presented one aggravating factor, that the murder had been especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, in that it involved torture or serious physical abuse beyond that necessary to produce death. The fact that Sanders was shot multiple times and then covered almost 100 yards while bleeding proved that the crime committed fit the criteria. So the jury found the state had proven the aggravating circumstance beyond a reasonable doubt and found it outweighed all the mitigating circumstances. Andre Bland was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder, attempted aggravated robbery, and attempted first-degree murder. Andre Bland was sentenced to death. The legal battle was just beginning. His attorneys immediately filed appeals, and the case would wind through Tennessee's court system for years. On direct appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court, his attorneys raised multiple issues and challenged whether the aggravating circumstance was properly supported by the evidence. They also argued that the jury instructions were incorrect and raised proportionality review questions on the fact that the sentence was too harsh relative to similar cases. However, in December 1997, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued its opinion after reviewing every argument and examining the trial record. One justice even wrote a dissenting opinion, arguing that while the evidence supported premeditation and the finding of torture, the death sentence was disproportionate compared to similar cases, but the majority disagreed. The court affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence, and just like the previous courts, they found the evidence sufficient to support the jury's finding of premeditation. They found the evidence sufficient to support the jury's finding of torture, defined as the infliction of severe physical or mental pain upon the victim while he remains conscious, and they found that the aggravating circumstance outweighed the mitigating circumstances. Every level of Tennessee's judicial system had now reviewed what happened in that parking lot on October 9th, and the conclusion was consistent. So as of 2025, Andre remains on Tennessee's death row. Tennessee resumed executions recently after a 5-year pause, implementing a new single drug protocol, and there are approximately 45 inmates currently on the state's death row. Andre is one of them. He's been waiting for over 3 decades. Sanders' daughters are in their 30s now. They grew up without their father, never got to know the man their grandmother described as sweet and good. Andre said he hadn't been trying to kill his victim, and that was his defense. But what he actually did was much more than that, and it ultimately led to the man bleeding on the ground and eventually dying while he went home to sleep. This is the story of the parking lot hunter who pulled the trigger again and again and again. But he's still alive today, waiting on Tennessee's death row, while his victim has been dead for over 30 years. If you want to see more chilling videos like this, like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.
In the darkest night, you are my shining light. When I am weak,